So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing the 2001 independent sci-fi movie, The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, a movie directed by Larry Blamire, a man who's had a rather interesting history, because originally he went to the Art Institute of Boston to be an illustrator, but sometime around the 1980s he actually took up stage acting for a bit, which somehow led to him becoming a writer for several stage plays, with his big claim to fame being Jump Camp. Fast forward to the late 90s, and Larry would eventually start to come up with the idea of shooting an ultra-low budget spoof of 1950s bargain basement science fiction movies, which resulted in the eventual creation of his most well-known movie, The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, which proved to be so popular that two sequels were produced. The first being The Lost Skeleton Returns Again, followed by The Lost Skeleton Walks Among Us. That all said, I have a rather interesting history with this movie, because during the early 2000s, when Godzilla was celebrating his, at the time, 50th anniversary, you had all of these DVDs coming out, and depending on what Godzilla movie you got, certain DVDs always had certain trailers. And I remember that the DVD copies for both Godzilla vs. Hedorah, along with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla from 1974, both contained the exact same trailers, which featured a trailer for The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra. And at the time, because of the way the trailer was presented, I straight up thought it was a authentic 1950s B movie that I'd never heard of before around that time period. It wasn't until way later during my college years when I actually decided to do a mini Godzilla marathon with a few of my college friends, and I decided to watch some of the trailers on the DVD before we even started the movie proper, and they all saw the trailer for The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra and lost their shit because they really wanted to check out the movie, and we eventually did, and we all had a blast watching the movie at the time. But the funniest thing was that at the time, I always assumed that this was an authentic B movie from the 1950s. It wasn't until one of my friends brought up the detail that no, it's not a movie from the 1950s. It's actually a movie from 2001 that was shot and made to look like a movie from the 1950s. This blew my mind. And since then, this friend of mine has been requesting me to do a review of this particular movie for some time, making it the second movie that they requested on this channel, with the first being The Jerk, starring Steve Martin. And so, here is my long-awaited review for The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra. As for the plot of the movie, a dedicated scientist, along with his clueless little wife, are looking for a rare element referred to as astrotherium in order to benefit the fields of science. And while their search for this ever-elusive element continues, several strange individuals consisting of a rival scientist who intends to use the astrotherium for his own nefarious needs, a radioactive monster, two curious aliens who try to blend in with the humans, a furry, and a park ranger, who all get entangled in the couple's search for the ever-elusive astrotherium, resulting in the resurrection of a rather crabby skeleton who not only intends on world domination, but also getting married. Can our cast of characters put their differences aside and stop the skeleton from world domination, or will the skeleton succeed in both taking over the world and getting married? Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, let's start with the acting, because the acting itself is bad, but it's bad in a good kind of sense. And what I mean by that is, normally when you have a lot of these movies that try to be bad on purpose, with an example like Sharknado, a lot of those actors are giving bad performances, but they're not putting any effort into the performance themselves, resulting in the bad performance just being a regular bad performance. With the actors in this movie, they're fully committed to their roles and do give bad performances, but they're done so in a way in which you could tell there was a lot more effort put into the bad performance itself. And you can see the actors giving it their all to give these bad performances, but done so in a way in which they seemed like they enjoyed giving the bad performance, resulting in a movie that has acting that's bad, but in a good kind of way, given that it's really trying to replicate that acting style usually associate with B movies from the 1950s, 1960s, and succeeds at replicating that caliber of acting. which also leads into the script writing itself, because the actual dialogue in this is really ridiculous. Although I will admit there are some aspects of the dialogue that do get a little repetitive, which I'll talk about later. But as far as the actual writing itself is concerned, there are some great lines of dialogue here. My favorite line of dialogue occurs near the beginning of the movie, where you have the scientist and his wife asking this farmer for directions to the cabin, and he just gives this long, lengthy monologue where he's describing all these macabre places. It's super hilarious. The quote itself being, "Stay on this road here, past Dead Man's Curve. You'll come to an old fence called the Devil's Fence. From there, go on foot till you come to a valley known as the Cathedral of Lost Soap, smack in the center of what they call Forgetful Milkman's Quakerage. Stay right on the path of Staring Skulls. You'll come to a place called Death Clearing. Cabin's right there. Can't miss it." And there's just some really quotable lines of dialogue as well. Everything from, "I'm a scientist, I don't believe in anything," to "noises in woods at night." I mean, I could go on, but I think it's just one of those cases where you just have to experience the movie itself to hear some of these lines of dialogue, because most of them are pretty funny. Another aspect of the movie I really liked is the props themselves, in that sense where when you look at them, they look very cheap, but again, like I said earlier about the acting, it's intentionally meant to look cheap, to replicate that visual aesthetic of movies from that time period. And I do think that the production crew did a really good job of replicating the visual aesthetic of those kind of movies as well, with the most impressive prop being the mutant costume used in the second half of the movie. Because if you ever looked at a lot of monster costumes from those kind of movies, all of them just looked very cheap and plasticky, yet the monster here is, by definition, cheap and plasticky, but it's done so on purpose. And on top of that, I'll say this much, I really love the mutants' choice in footwear, which consists of military combat boots. I thought that was a very hilarious detail to the overall mutant costume. And for the final aspect of the movie that I liked is the titular skeleton himself, in terms of how he's depicted, because he's depicted in a way in which you didn't expect. And what I mean is that anytime you have these stories of a character resurrecting some supernatural entity, such as a god or a sorcerer, normally the entity themselves usually have a very calm and serious demeanor, whereas the skeleton, on the other hand, is not that at all. Instead of having a calm and serious demeanor, he's just some cranky asshole, and that makes him a very hilarious character within the movie in and of itself, because the filmmakers could have had him be just some serious entity, but no, the filmmakers decided to have fun with this skeleton's personality by going against the grain and giving the skeleton a personality that we weren't expecting, which I think worked out for the best. Now, an aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the fight between the titular skeleton along with the mutant. Because on the one hand, I think having these two kinds of monsters fight against each other is a pretty unique combo that's never been done before, nor has it been done since then. The closest example I could think of is the robot versus the Aztec mummy from 1957, but that's between a robot and a mummy, not an alien and a skeleton. The problem with the actual fight itself, the fight choreography isn't the most impressive thing ever, but given the limitations of the production of the movie, it actually makes sense in terms of why the fight was choreographed the way it was, given that you have a guy wearing a mutant costume holding a skeleton, which is probably the best they could do. But perhaps my biggest problem with the fight itself is the lack of creative shots, because when you do see the skeleton fight the mutant, it's nothing but a continuous wide shot of the skeleton trying to kill the mutant for several minutes. Sure, once in a while we might cut back to the main cast of characters watching the fight and reacting to it, but anytime we cut back to the mutant and skeleton fighting each other, it's just this one continuous wide shot of the mutant slowly walking backwards with the skeleton strangling him. I just wish there was some more creative shots, like maybe we cut two extreme close-ups of the feet of the mutant and skeleton moving in one direction, close-ups of the hands, maybe some extreme close-ups of the face. It just needed more creative shots. And while there are definitely some shots here and there are enough of them are my problem. Now, in terms of the problems that I have with the movie, honestly, my biggest problem with the movie is the middle act of the movie itself, for a couple reasons. Reason number one, the pacing gets halted here, because the pacing in the first and last third move at a very brisk pace that works to the advantage of the movie itself. But once the middle act of the movie begins, the pacing comes to a screeching halt, losing that momentum that was started in the first act of the movie. It moves at such a slow pace that it honestly makes the middle act of the movie feel much longer than it needs to. Reason number two, the plot also kind of seems to stop here too. But again, much like the pacing, I remember all of the key events that happened in the first and last third of the movie, but the middle act of the movie, I don't really recall anything of significance really happening all that much, other than the fact that this is pretty much the first time all of our key characters meet in one location, and seeing Ranger Brad getting killed by the mutant off screen. Other than that, nothing much really happens. Reason number three, the repetitive nature of the joke itself. And what I mean by this is that for the first third, given that this movie is not only meant to serve as an homage to 1950s B movies, but it's also meant to be a parody of them as well. So there are points in time where the movie does poke fun at these cheesy sci-fi movies of that time period, along with having some really funny lines of dialogue. And for the first third, a lot of those jokes are actually really funny. And even though I do think there are some lines of dialogue that are funny for the remainder of the movie, a good majority of the dialogue and scenes that are meant to poke fun at 1950s B movies just lose their flavor after a while and they stop kind of being funny. And what makes it worse is that the same kind of joke gets told repeatedly for the remainder of the movie, and certain jokes just overstay their welcome after a while. So for my final verdict of The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, the movie is both terrible but brilliant at the same time, in that sense where it's a movie that's purposely made to be bad. However, unlike a movie that's produced by The Asylum, where they're clearly trying to make the movie bad on purpose, but put absolutely no effort into the movie itself, resulting in the movie just being plain bad, with The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, on the other hand, the entire film crew put in a lot of effort to make the movie as terrible as much as possible. Everything from the writing, the acting, the special effects, resulting in a movie that, by definition, is terrible, but it succeeds in being terrible because there was a lot of genuine effort put into making the movie as bad as much as possible. However, that all said, even though this movie does accomplish its job of being bad on purpose, if I actually had to pick out any actual problems that I have with the movie myself, I do think the middle act of the movie drags severely. Because this portion of the movie is very dialogue heavy and not much really happens. And moving past that, I think there are some editing choices that occur during the final battle that I think could have been handled a little better. And the movie's sense of humor, while funny, does get really repetitive after a while. But overall, The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra succeeds at being a loving homage to 1950s B movies. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra? So it looks as if the movie got generally average reception, and so for my final rating of The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. So, what's your favorite movie that was made to be bad on purpose? And see you later.